This is such a thoughtful program, and what a fantastic idea, the idea of celebrating the past accomplishments of an art institution or any institution as also something where we reimagine the absences or less visible places of the past to create spaces for a future otherwise. It reminds me of something that Kavitha Koshi wrote in response to the late Chicana queer feminist Gloria Anzaldua's concept of el mundo zurdo, which understands difference and identity in terms of interdependence and relationally as sharing certain experiences and oppressions while not boiling those affinities down to mere sameness. Koshi writes, quote, "I dream of more inclusive spaces where the identities I carry with me do not limit my ability to connect with others. Because it is inclusive and non-binary, El Mundo Zurdo activism is seamless and boundless." And so I think that this symposium is a rather brilliant way for us to both practice Anzaldua's El Mundo Zurdo and also to do what Koshi writes, which is to dream of more inclusive spaces. And to dream of more inclusive spaces seems like an appropriate place to begin a conversation about disability, art, and the Biggs Museum. When we talk about the intersection of disability and art in the Art Museum, we often begin by thinking about physical accessibility to the space and to the art itself, which is, of course, a thinking about inclusive spaces. And yes, physical inclusion through access is essential, but I'd like to push into this idea a little through the lens of what disability activist and scholar Mia Mingus calls liberatory access. She writes, "When I say liberatory access, I mean access that is more than simply having a ramp or being sent free or providing captions. Access for the sake of access or inclusion is not necessarily liberatory, but access done in the service of love, justice, connection, and community is liberatory and has the power to transform. I want us to think beyond just knowing the right things to say and be able to truly engage. I want us to I want us to not only make sure things are accessible, but also work to transform the conditions that created that inaccessibility in the first place. To not only meet the immediate needs of access, whether that is access to spaces or access to education and resources, or access to dignity and agency, but also work to make sure that the inaccessibility doesn't happen again." So to dream of more inclusive spaces is also a practice of dreaming of more accessible spaces. And to dream of more accessible spaces requires, as Mingus suggests, doing more than producing physical access through ramps, braille, etc., but a profound rethinking of what access means. Or as Kelly Fritsch writes, we should think about access, quote, as an ongoing and shifting process rather than as a mode of solving individualized problems. And I think the point that Mingus and other disability studies scholars are making here is that inclusion, accessibility, and disability, for that matter, are not neutral terms, but are political. And of course, by political, I mean understanding that our ideas, language, art, everything does not come to us as a natural given occurrence, but are produced and shaped by cultural norms, power relations, ideology. Or as Alison Kafer writes, quote, "To say that something is political means that it is implicated in relations of power and that those relations, their assumptions and their effects are contested and contestable, open to dissent and debate," close quote. I believe that additionally, disability scholars and activists like Mingus and Kafer are pointing out that the function of inclusion and access can, while well-intentioned, come to us in the form of easy assimilation. That is a standardizing impulse to merge disability into this larger bell curve of normalcy, rather than doing the really radical and difficult work of dismantling normalcy itself. So what we're talking about is an anti-assimilation trajectory that works against this normalizing impulse and performs something more akin to Anzaldua's El Mundo Zurdo. So in this talk, I'm going to introduce what I believe are some of the more established methodological approaches to the intersection of disability and art that scholars like Anne Millette Gallant, Amanda Kashia, and Anne Fox have forwarded, And I'm going to do this by working them through a selection of pieces from the Biggs collection. And I'll say up front that I specialize in disability studies as it intersects with modern and contemporary art. And while my master's degree dabbled in 19th century American art, it is not my area of expertise. And some of you are, this is your area. So if there's Q&A afterwards, by all means, let me know where my own absences are. So this talk is also designed for a general audience that may have no background in disability studies and how it might work with art, which means that it will be a little bit of an amuse-bouche or small appetizers of how one might think about disability in art. So for those of you that are well-versed in disability studies and art, stick with me. I'll conclude with some of my own work, which is a methodological intervention into this subfield. And it forms the basis of my dissertation, what I'm calling CRIP materiality. But throughout this talk, I also hope to suggest that while we do the hard work of dreaming of more inclusive spaces, we also understand that those spaces might seem to hinge on an impulse toward assimilation or the normalization of disability, but instead can and should form through the dismantling of normalcy altogether. And so to dream of more inclusive spaces is not really about inclusion as we might conceive of it in a neoliberal context, but more about an ethics of care. So now I'm going to move backwards a little and present a brief overview of how we think and theorize with, through, and about disability. Or in other words, what is disability studies? Well, in the United States, thinking about disability tends to run along medicalized lines. We think about it as a condition that individual bodies experience, one that must be treated, and if at all possible, cured, or what the field of disability studies calls the medical model. Or we might think about it as the object of our charity. We like to raise money for disability. We embrace warm and fuzzy disability narratives. All the while, our social welfare nets are eroded in a society that still insists on individualism as the marker of good citizenship. But disability studies asks us to question the individual. It's doing a thing. Asks us to question the individual as problem. Question the individual as problem, and instead to look at the social structures surrounding disability, or what we call the social model. So disability studies recognizes that power and privilege are tied to bodily normalcy and hierarchies of health. So for example, we might question defining disabled people as heroic overcomers, saintly spirits, victims, or villains. These stories have the curious effect of at once making disabled people hypervisible because they are marked by these stories, yet invisible because they serve more as narrative plot devices to move the story along for the betterment of other able-bodied characters, and thus denying the complicated and lived reality of the disabled person. And I think there's like a timing thing happening. I don't know how. And so in the humanities, we explore how cultural representation has circulated those narratives, whether to perpetuate them or push back against them. Disability studies explores the history of disabled people, authors, and artists, reclaiming their contributions and stories for disabled culture, and marking where they have been the victims of oppression because of their health. It helps us understand that historically, disability has been intimately intertwined with the construction of other identities, racial, gendered, sexual, and national. And while it fights the stigma of ableism being the belief that disability is somehow an inferior state that needs to be eradicated, is something similar to thinking about racism or sexism. So ableism, and in a larger sense, disability studies is about all of our bodies and showing us that normalcy is a cultural construct. Disability studies fights the tyranny of normalcy. It helps us celebrate the wide variation of human embodiment. And indeed, disability studies claims disability as an identity that has a great deal to teach us. The concept of disability gain, for example, asks what would be lost if we lost disability? What ways of understanding embodiment or ways of knowing or producing creative knowledge would be lost? And concepts like disability aesthetics forwards that disability is in fact a powerful source of creativity. So what specifically can we do with disability studies in art? Well, a number of scholars have already begun to make important inroads here. And again, I'd cite Anne Millette Gallant and Amanda Kashia and Anne Fox. In fact, this particular subfield of art and disability has been percolating for long enough now that I think we can begin to recognize certain methodological consistencies. So again, I'm going to outline some of these here. So we have biography, subject matter, style, or mode of representation, and then I'm going to conclude with my own addition to this approach, crip materiality. So one of the most common approaches for thinking about disability in art is in relation to the biography and the lived experience of the artist. One might consider some of the following questions. Was this artist disabled? Did that disability affect, influence, or shape the art produced? How have art institutions and scholars contextualized or erased this information from the records and interpretive materials? A biography-based approach is often used in conjunction with what we might call an activist model, where disabled artists celebrate the richness and vibrancy of the lived experience of disability through self-representation in order to point out, among other things, that the often erased histories of artists' disabilities, or the way that the art institution characterizes these disabilities, are not as generative sources of creativity, but merely medical conditions that the artist was forced to overcome. There are a number of reasons to make use of the biographical approach, as it allows students and scholars to uncover past histories of disabled artists whose disability, due to stigma or prejudice, was covered up and forgotten. It also recognizes the creative, professional, and cultural possibilities of disability that exceed a simplistic medical context in order to construct a more complex understanding of disability identity. Additionally, this approach acknowledges that disabled artists don't simply reflect the world in which they live, but rather that through their art, they produce political and cultural change. For example, the work of disabled artist and curator Riva Lehrer attends to a world that normally overlooks the beauty of disabled bodies and minds by creating portraits of herself and other disabled friends and colleagues that point out the ableist assumptions underlying traditional notions of beauty, while also formulating an alternate aesthetic that positions disability as vital rather than as the extreme limit or aberrant exception. Or, to take an example from the Biggs' collection, we might look at this work of sand art by Andrew Clemens. He was born in Iowa in 1857 to German immigrants, and at the age of 6 came down with what was called at the time brain fever. It was probably meningitis or encephalitis. And as a result, he lost his ability to hear. Because he became deaf at such a young age, his speech did not develop in a way that allowed him to attend his local school. And at the age of 13, his parents enrolled him in the Iowa Institute for the Deaf, where he studied for the next 7 years. On his trips home during the summer and after he graduated, he explored the trails and nature of Pikes Peak, which is a scenic region on the border of Wisconsin and Iowa, and specifically spent time in and around Bridal Falls, where its waters flowed into this wooded area called Pictured Rocks. Here's a picture of Pictured Rocks. And there was found an abundance of this highly, brightly colored red and orange sandstone. And so he would go and scrape off the sandstone and create sand and, divide it into these separate brightly colored piles. And then it's unclear exactly when or why he started creating these sand jars. But he did, and originally they were just very kind of simple geometric designs. Later he included words, and then as the United States Centennial approached in 1876, he began to incorporate more of these kind of patriotic symbols. So there's an anecdote that's recalled by Clemens's brother, where a young deaf man selling shoelaces and pencils goes door to door, and they come to Clemens's house, and he meets Andrew and says, I'm deaf, you're deaf, we could have like this deaf salesman team. And Andrew declined and apparently told his mother, quote, "Never will I try to make a living because of my affliction. I want to do something with my life." And this anecdote is conveyed in Roy Siklowski's biography of Clemens, and really the only biography of him that I know of, at least. It's a very helpful source of material about him, but it is not at all surprising that, and this is an example of the difference that disability studies makes, actually, in intervening into these narratives, that Zuchlaucki interprets this story as evidence that Clemens had confidence in his abilities to make a conventional living despite his hearing impairment, and that truly Clemens can be said to have achieved his goal of being able to support himself and then thrive regardless of his hearing loss. While it seems clear that deafness may have limited Clemens's social development, he nonetheless adapted and empowered himself with supreme focus, a steady hand, and sheer artistic talent. Now, in all fairness, this interpretation of disability and the life of the artist is not unusual. In fact, it is so normalized to couch disability in terms of these overcoming narratives that we might not even notice that it is happening, unless we rethink it using the tenets of disability studies, which would ask us not to frame this narrative in that Clemens was a successful artist despite his disability, but because of his disability. And this is where we might think of a deaf gain. What is gained by Clemens's deafness? Would Clemens have been an artist had he not been deaf? Of course, I have no way of answering this, but even though the previous anecdote about traveling deaf salesmen might suggest that Clemens desired to make a living despite his disability and not because of it, I offer you these two examples and I think might suggest otherwise. First, there's this really amazing example of one of his sand bottles that says, "Filled by A. Clemens, a deaf mute of McGregor, Iowa." And the second one is actually, later he starts creating these labels that he puts on the bottom of the bottles that say, "Pictured rock sand, put up by A. Clemens, deaf mute, McGregor, Iowa." So clearly Clemens wasn't opposed to acknowledging or even capitalizing on his status as deaf and mute to sell his wares. But it's also the case that this type of advertising of one's disability was not at all unusual at the time, and we might even argue it's still used to sell the work of self-taught artists today. And let me be clear, I am not making a judgment on this either way. People, especially disabled people, who are disproportionately live in poverty then and now, need to make a living and, do that however you can. Clemens's sand art bottles are, as you can see, though, in this particular example, especially detailed, complicated, highly skilled productions. And so I'd argue that the confluence of both this level of artistic ability and the accompanied labeling of deaf-mute actually fits not into the history of, say, begging cards where disabled would sell basic goods on the basis of their disability and more as an act of begging and, reciprocal charity. But this is something more akin, I think, to the virtuosity of some of the most popular disabled performers of the 19th century who created beautiful art, and I'd say rather smartly took advantage of the system that on the one side might seem to be exploitative, and it was, but on the other side provided an income. And in a system that's rigged against you, you do what you can to make it work. And I'd say that there's something delightfully subversive about that. And so here we have a typical poster from this time, and on the left is blind Tom Wiggins, who is an exceptionally popular performer at the time. And then on the right, we have this dime museum poster that says, right there on the bottom, I don't know if it's visible, but the sand artist, Clemens, the sand artist, and other marvels. It's also the case that there are a number of reviews and little articles about Clemens' work while he was alive, and they all mention that he was deaf and mute. And I suppose what I'm additionally arguing here is that we have these three examples of the hypervisibility of his disability, the jar, the labels, the reception, and yet the impulse by the biographer, and again, I'm not trying to shame anyone, this just happens all the time, the impulse is to normalize the disability by papering over the obvious disability with this overcoming narrative, as if disability wasn't even there in the first place. And in the case of Clemens, being deaf and mute was clearly important, not just to him being an artist, but also to his ability to make a living. So Clemens presents us with one of these methodological approaches to thinking about disability in art. And I'd like to point out that there are some pitfalls with the biographical analysis. There are lots, in fact, but in terms of disability, it can restrict the expansive possibilities of disability to only recognizable or self-proclaimed identity by the artist. And important questions to consider here would be, can artists who do not claim disability identity create disability art? And who gets to claim disability? And what happens when an artist with a disability doesn't want to claim that identity at all? And so there are really important questions to keep in mind with this particular approach. Another way to think about disability in art is to think about the subject matter itself. This approach asks, is there a depiction of a disabled person? Is disability represented in as a negative stereotype or a nuanced identity? Does that representation reveal something about the time and place that the art was created? Often attention to subject matter seeks to locate cultural, social, and political constructions of disability within the representation itself. This approach can be considered alongside what we might think about as like a historical model, where art helps us to recognize, examine, and critique the way disability was contextualized at a certain moment in time and place. For example, what does Mark Quinn's sculpture of Alison Lapper Pregnant convey about the visibility of disability in the public sphere? Or let's consider this through one of the paintings from the Biggs's collection. This is George Cochrane Lambdin's Compensations from 1865. And here I'm just going to read actually part of the entry that is in the Biggs's really great collections catalog. So it says, in the 1860s, Philadelphia artist George Cochrane Landon created a small group of Civil War paintings. These were not battle scenes, but rather compositions that addressed the sentimental and psychological aspects of war: separation from loved ones, nostalgia for home life, loneliness, and memories of the hardships of military existence. In these paintings, there is a likeness to George Lambdin's brother, Harry Landon, and references Harry's war experience. 22-year-old Harry Landon enlisted in the 121st Pennsylvania Regiment, Army of the Potomac, and in August of 1862, sustained a serious thigh wound, and then afterwards he returned to Germantown for surgery and recuperation. And so I think it's just a good summary, obviously, of just sort of what's happening, and it's important to note that Harry never fully recovered from this wound. He actually died in 1870 at the age of 30. Okay, so what might we do with this painting in relation to disability studies? Well, for one, it could help to consider this briefly alongside Thomas Akins's most famous Gross Clinic to get a sense of two very different ways to depict disability soon after the American Civil War. And I like this comparison for a number of reasons, but one of which is that they're actually both dealing with a thigh wound of sorts. I mean, in the Gross Clinic, the wound is created by the surgeon in order to get to and remove the diseased bone. And in the case of Landon, he apparently suffered this serious thigh wound, which in contrast to Akins's open reddish pink wound is actually sentimentally covered over by this reddish pink blanket. And obviously the Gross Clinic is well known for this story of being too real for the viewing public, leading to its censorship from the official Centennial exhibition and its placement instead in the very medical context of the Army Medical Museum's exhibition. And so I think we could focus here on the way that disability was supposed to be visualized soon after the American Civil War, which was that it was not supposed to be visualized, unless, of course, it was to serve as an abstraction through metaphor for the reconciliation of a nation, quite literally a visual aid to bind up the nation's wounds. Or another way to think about this is as a national overcoming narrative. And I've mentioned this before, this idea of the overcoming narrative. I think Joseph Strauss does a great job of explaining this, and he says, it's a narrative of overcoming disability that emerges in the wake of the medical model. With its emphasis on remediation and cure, disability is something to be eliminated or normalized in the course of a narrative trajectory toward normal selfhood. He goes on to use Beethoven as an example of this, and he writes, Beethoven was, quote, celebrated for what he achieved in spite of disability. In such a scenario, the composer's disability, having been triumphantly overcome, will be judged irrelevant to the music. So we might also think about Lambdin's painting still further in terms of visibility and disability, and what it means that his wounded leg is shrouded here by the blanket. And yet what is visible, you can see the detail on this side, is the back of a wooden chair upon which his legs are presumably propped. A wooden chair with two visible wooden legs, perhaps in fact a foreshadowing on the part of Landon of what was to come should the leg wound not heal properly. That is amputation and being fit with a wooden prosthetic leg, which was a vastly expanding industry at the time. But that his wounded leg was itself covered might also have something to do with what Susan Schweik writes about in her book, The Ugly Laws. The Ugly Laws were laws passed in the United States soon after the end of the American Civil War in order to control who could and could not enter the public sphere. They varied from place to place, but common to all was a desire to keep people whose appearance did not conform to normative standards of beauty out of sight and out of public view. So one of the most popular ones was passed in 1881 in Chicago, and it says, quote, any person who is diseased, maimed, mutilated, or in any way deformed so as to be an unsightly or disgusting object, or an improper person to be allowed in or on the streets, highways, thoroughfares, or public places in the city, shall not therein or thereon expose himself to public view under the penalty of a fine. From the language of this ordinance, it is clear that that it was the public display of disability that was most offensive. In other words, if the disabled person covered themselves up properly, strapped on the right prosthetics, and generally tried to pass as non-disabled, there wouldn't be a problem, or at least not a legal one. So, in general, there are a number of reasons to consider subject matter when one approaches the intersection of disability and art, and it helps to build a historical archive for disabled people whose identity was either erased from the record or was seen as so unwanted or aberrant or ugly that it was simply overlooked. It also establishes a way to think more critically about how disability as an identity was produced and formed over time. That is, disability is not static, but shifts depending on changing cultural values. Something to keep in mind, though, while thinking about this particular approach is that it can often result in us thinking about physically visible disabilities. It can also problematically place the viewer in the position of seeking out and potentially retroactively diagnosing disability in art. And arguably, that kind of diagnostic vision reproduces the same oppressive medical gaze that the activist model has fought against in an effort to return the agency of representation back to disabled people themselves. So, I'm almost done, don't worry. The third approach is stylistic. That is, does the mode of representation, the brushstroke, composition, use of line, convey disability, even if the artist is not disabled, even if the subject, there is no obvious representation of disability? Well, disability studies scholar Tobin Siebers considers the use of broken and disjointed brushstrokes by modern artists like Pablo Picasso as a revaluing of disability and indeed the expression of a certain attraction to the aesthetics of disability. Siebers provocatively claimed that, quote, disability aesthetics embraces beauty that seems by traditional standards to be broken, and yet it is not less beautiful, but more so as a result. Siebers, in fact, points to the Nazis' degenerate art exhibition as evidence. The Nazis rejected, I'm quoting, the Nazis rejected the modern in art as degenerate and ugly because they viewed it as representing physical and mental disability. Hitler saw in paintings of Modigliani, Klee, and Chagall images of misshapen cripples and racial inferiors, when the rest of the world saw masterpieces of modern art. Significantly, Siebers does not see an absence of disability representation in art, but in fact our failure to recognize its presence. He posits that we don't see disability broadly in art history because we have limited our gaze to look for visibly recognizable disabled people, as opposed to the aesthetics, or perhaps style, of disability. In this way, disability is opened up to the expansive possibilities of recognizing the broken brushstroke of Picasso as embodying both physically and affectively a disability experience. And so here I think we can look at Edward Lauper's portrait of May Mathco, which is in the Biggs's collection, where there's no disability represented. I don't think the artist was disabled. But this is still an artwork that we can think about in terms of disability because stylistically, its fauvist colors and disjointed outlines are emblematic of this larger idea of disability aesthetics. So I'm going to now move on and propose a little bit of a new approach that I'm calling crip materiality. So I'm going to back up a little to where we started with this talk and think about what access and inclusion might mean. So since the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act, art museums and galleries have made strides to accommodate visitors with physical and cognitive disabilities through ramps, touch tours, and audio description. These are vital efforts. However, by focusing on physical and intellectual accommodation, art institutions run the risk of not addressing deeper structural and discursive challenges presented by the ways in which the presumed norms of ability shape not just access to art spaces, but also curatorial practice, art conservation, the pedagogical structure and mission of the art institution itself. To fulfill the spirit of the ADA, I contend that it is incumbent upon the institution of the museum to consider disability as not just a matter of disability subjects that might include the representation of disability in works of art, the disabled artist, or the disabled audience member. As crucial as these are, limiting our attention to the disability subject can obscure the extent to which ableism shapes the very foundation of the museum as institution. To get at the disability subject as foundational, I propose a methodological shift, what I'm calling crip materiality, that allows us to recognize disability beyond embodied experience, that is, to think disability at the very fibers of art materials and fabrication. And I'll note that my use of the word crip here actually builds on the work of disability studies scholars in the area of what has come to be known as crip theory, which claims the word cripple in a similar vein that queer theory claims queer, both to reappropriate while also conserving this word of injury to politicize and decenter the legal and medical sphere's use of labels such as homosexual and disabled. So crip is very much intended to signal my investment in a somewhat more radical understanding of the intersection between disability and art. So crip materiality argues that despite the discourse surrounding institutional critique and the dematerialization of the art object in contemporary art, there hasn't been a reevaluation of the treatment of the physical disintegration of art from a crip theory perspective, where within the art institution, material precarity in artworks is often framed as unhealthy or as a disabled body in need of remediation or correction. Crucially, crip materiality recognizes the extent to which ableist ideology shapes not just attitudes about our physical bodies and minds and built environments, but also unconsciously and perhaps insidiously shapes our pedagogical, discursive, and evaluative norms regarding the very material of objects. So I'm going to skip through this a little bit and say that, in other words, what I'm arguing is that in addition to thinking about the biography of the artist, the subject matter, and the style, we can think about the very materiality of the art itself and the ways in which it, like bodies, breaks down and falls apart due to age, accident, or environmental vulnerability. And so one of the case studies here is Klaus Oldenburg's 1978 polyurethane sculpture, Soft Screw, which has been framed as what's called an object of inherent vice. An inherent vice is a art conservation label, and it's used to classify art that is unintentionally composed, and that unintentional part is key, of one or more materials known to degrade, corrode, or cause the object as a whole to fall apart in a way that cannot be stopped or prevented by conservation science. The words of the term itself, inherent vice, code material fragility as moral failure, a form of self-directed transgression. These are objects behaving badly. Soft Screw was originally intended to stand on its head in a vertical position to allow the softness of the polyurethane material to bend under the weight of gravity, a screw with a limp. But the limp was short-lived because Soft Screw is unexpectedly experiencing a reversion back to its liquid state. And you can see here at the tip that it's actually dripping onto this platform underneath. So in a letter in a 2002 letter to Bernice Rose, the then director of Pace Wildenstein Gallery, Alvin Lane, the original owner of the Chazen's edition of Soft Screw, wrote with concern that it was self-destructing, and those are his words, and worried that the president of art conservation associations had, quote, no recommended treatment, and that the rubber will continue to decompose over time. Consequently, any repairs performed to the sculpture will not remain stable, close quote. Soft Screw is a non-compliant and profoundly anti-assimilationist object. In fact, it's outright rebelling, in my opinion, a rebellion against the intentions of its maker, against the financial investment of the museum as guarantor of cultural value, and frankly, a form of radical passivity against compulsive productivity. And certainly, material vulnerability is something that we can think about in the Biggs collection, because yes, things do fall apart. But more so than that, I think crypt materiality allows us to think about the importance of holding open a space for vulnerability in the museum, a space for physical fragility, and a space for questioning the original itself. That is, questioning the idea that when something materially changes due to age or accident or inherent vice, it somehow is growing further away from its original state. Or to put this another way, in a roundtable discussion about some of the deteriorating work of Eva Hesse, a contributor vocalized that, quote, several of Hesse's sculptures have deteriorated to the point that they no longer resemble their original selves, and in many cases they cannot be handled or installed as they originally were, close quote. And it is a fascinating statement, really. Indeed, what does it mean to not resemble oneself as an artwork or a person? That is, what does it mean to be so profoundly different that a fissure is marked between, or to separate a being into a before and unrecognizable after? What does it mean to exist after you cease to be what you are? The phrasing is perhaps familiar to anyone who has become disabled, has dementia, or who is reeling in the aftermath of trauma. I'm not myself today. She no longer recognized him. The woman I once knew is gone. Illness and disability set off a series of these before and after narratives that hinge on the idea that one indeed has an original self to begin with, and that original self is the authentic one, the best version. It is to be protected, and when lost, it must be mourned and memorialized, often at the expense of the new, altered self. The idea, though, that the work of art no longer resemble their original selves open a space where the artwork has seemingly undergone some unavoidable, unwanted, altering state akin to disability, dementia, or trauma. And we might even think here with Catherine Malibu's concept of destructive plasticity, where plasticity is not just invention or flexibility. Rather, plasticity holds within itself the potential to undo itself, to transform to the point of annihilation. To quote, might there be a type of plasticity that, under the effects of a wound, creates a certain form of being by effacing a previously existing identity? Might there be in the brain a destructive plasticity, the dark double of the positive and constructive plasticity that molds neuronal connections? Might such plasticity make form through the annihilation of form? And so looking at the ways in which art objects fall apart is also an argument for the importance of plasticity as opposed to, say, elasticity. Elasticity being the concept where, like a rubber band, a mind or an identity or a work of art can stretch under the pressure of trauma, disease, or deterioration, but then through talk therapy or medication or science somehow then return to its original shape. But elasticity, or the ability to return to the before entirely, is an illusion. And yet, even in its impossibility, it continues to infiltrate a culture fixated on the ideology of cure, where the myth of the original self or being or object is treasured at the expense of new forms of life. Instead, plasticity allows for a recognition that there is no true overcoming narrative. There is no real cure. We will never be who we were, for better or worse, because we bend and stretch anew again and again, never to return. Or in the case of some of our most materially precarious art, it is not a matter of bending or stretching, but of contracting, of becoming brittle, less flexible, and weak. But this destruction and move towards weakness does not have to be contextualized as a tragic end. We can think about some of the works around us today, here in this museum, to find the cracks and the stains, the shifted and stapled together, and think not about an elastic return, but about the plastic possibilities of disability. So thank you very much.